He left her without knowing she was pregnant. Years later, a little boy with his eyes begged for medicine, and everything unraveled. The morning had started like any other for Matthew Carter: meetings, phone calls, and a quick stop at the downtown medical research center where his company was finalizing a high-profile contract. He was used to walking into hospitals with the quiet confidence of someone who owned half the patents on the shelves. People moved aside when he entered. His schedule was packed to the minute, and his signature was worth millions. He had long ago accepted that his time wasn't really his anymore, it belonged to the empire he'd built. And he was fine with that. Or at least, he had been. Until today. As he stepped through the automatic doors of the clinic's reception area, his attention was caught by a sound that didn't quite belong. It wasn't a machine beeping or the rustle of lab coats, it was a child's voice. Desperate, trembling. Matthew slowed down, scanning the front desk where a boy, no older than 6, was standing on tiptoes, his small hands tightly gripping a pile of coins. He was speaking quickly, almost breathlessly, as if the words might slip away if he didn't get them out fast enough. "Please," the boy said, "my mom needs this medicine. I have money. I counted it twice." The nurse looked sympathetic but hesitant, glancing around for help. Matthew stood frozen for a second, something about the boy's face drawing him in. Blonde hair. Striking blue eyes. Pale cheeks and a stubborn little chin. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the child. He wasn't just any kid. He looked like someone. Someone Matthew had tried very hard not to think about for years. He walked over slowly, as if approaching a fragile object. The boy turned to him, clearly nervous but not afraid. Matthew crouched down to eye level, lowering his voice. "Hey there, what's your name?" The boy clutched his coins tighter, not answering right away. His eyes scanned Matthew's face, wary but curious. "Ben," he finally said. "Benjamin." Matthew's heart skipped. "And what's your mom's name?" The boy hesitated again, then said quietly, "Emily." "Emily Reeves." Matthew felt like the floor shifted under him. That name, he hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 7 years, not since the day he walked away from a woman he had loved more than he could admit. Back then, he told himself it was necessary. He had to focus. He had to climb higher. Emily had been gentle, creative, loyal, but she wanted things he didn't think he could give: family, stability, time. And so, he left her standing in the rain outside his apartment, no goodbye beyond a silent locked door. He swallowed hard. "And she's sick." Ben nodded, a little more confident now. "She doesn't get up much anymore. She needs her medicine. I came to get it for her, but I guess I didn't have enough." Matthew stood, quickly pulling his wallet from his coat. "Don't worry about the money," he told the nurse. "Put it on my account." The nurse hesitated, then nodded, and began filling the prescription. Matthew turned back to Ben. "Can I drive you home? I'd like to make sure your mom gets this safely." Ben looked at him, and there was a moment, a flicker of something unspoken. Then he nodded and reached for Matthew's hand. As they walked toward the exit, Matthew felt the weight of 7 years of silence press against his chest. If this was what it looked like, if this boy was really his, then everything was about to change. And somehow, he already knew it had. The ride to Ben's house was quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic and the soft hum of the engine. Matthew kept glancing at the boy in the passenger seat, trying to piece together everything that was unraveling inside him. There were too many questions, each one piling on the last, making it hard to focus. How could Emily have kept this from him? Had she known where to find him all these years? Why hadn't she reached out? But beneath all of that, beneath the confusion and the shock, was something deeper. Guilt. Because he already knew the answer to most of those questions. He had walked away and made it clear that his life didn't have space for her, or anything that came with her. Ben sat still, his hands resting in his lap, his small frame tense. Matthew could tell he wasn't used to being in a car like this. The boy kept glancing around the sleek interior, wide-eyed, but too polite to ask questions. It made Matthew's chest tighten. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just a child in need of help. This was his son. He could feel it. In the way the boy tilted his head when he was thinking, the way his blue eyes narrowed slightly when concentrating, it was like watching a reflection of a younger version of himself. The neighborhood they entered was quiet and worn down. Houses with chipped paint, patched roofs, and chain-link fences lined the street. When Ben pointed to a small, one-story house at the end of the block, Matthew's heart sank further. The porch steps were uneven, and the front door hung slightly crooked. It wasn't unsafe, but it screamed struggle. Survival. Ben led the way inside without a word. The living room was tidy but sparse. Faded curtains, an old couch with a crocheted blanket, and a few scattered toys told the story of a life lived with care but without much comfort. And then he saw her. Emily was lying on the couch, partially propped up by a pillow. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her skin pale, and her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked exhausted. But her eyes, those deep brown eyes, still held the same fire, even through the obvious fatigue. When she saw Matthew standing in her living room, medicine bag in hand, she went perfectly still. It was as if time stopped. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was at the clinic," he said, unsure of how to make this moment less surreal. "I saw Ben. He was trying to buy medicine for you." Her expression changed, and something like shame flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up straighter but winced slightly. "You didn't have to bring him back," she said, guarded. "I did," Matthew replied. "He shouldn't have had to do that alone." Emily looked at her son, who stood quietly beside the couch. "Ben, sweetheart, thank you. Go wash your hands, okay?" Ben nodded and left the room. The sound of water running in the bathroom offered a brief moment of privacy between them. Matthew looked at her closely. "Is he mine?" She stared back at him, and in that instant, he could see all the years between them, all the words left unsaid. "Yes," she said finally. "He's yours." He sat down in the chair across from her, the weight of those words sinking in. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't want a family. You made that very clear. I didn't want to trap you or be a burden. I made the decision to keep him on my own. And when I realized you'd moved on, I let you." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I didn't move on. I built walls. I thought it was the only way to become the man I needed to be." Emily looked down, her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. "You became someone else, Matthew. You cut off everyone who cared about you, including me. And then you disappeared." He didn't argue. Everything she said was true. She sighed. "I've been sick for a while. It comes and goes, but this time it hit hard. I didn't want Ben to see me like this. But I didn't have anyone else to call." "You should have called me," he said, softer now. "I didn't know if you'd care," she replied, her voice cracking. He leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "I care. I care more than you know. And I want to be here now. For him. For you." Emily didn't answer right away. Her face was unreadable. But then she nodded slowly. "You can stay. For now. But he doesn't know the truth yet. He thinks his dad is someone far away, not someone who left. I didn't want to give him that pain." Matthew swallowed hard. "Then let me earn the right to tell him. I won't walk away again." Ben returned to the room, drying his hands with a towel. "Mom, can we have soup tonight?" Emily smiled, weakly. "If we have the ingredients." Matthew stood. We do. I'll take care of it. As he stepped into the tiny kitchen, he realized how unfamiliar yet grounding this felt. Not business. Not success. Just a kitchen, a family, a second chance, one he never expected, but would do anything to keep. The next morning came with a softness Matthew hadn't felt in years. The house was still and quiet, filled only with the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of old floorboards adjusting to the change in temperature. He had fallen asleep on the worn-out recliner in the corner of the living room, a thin blanket barely covering him, but he hadn't minded. There was something oddly comforting about the faded floral curtains, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the sound of Ben's light footsteps padding into the room just after sunrise. The boy wasn't surprised to see him there. In fact, he smiled sleepily and climbed up beside him without asking. Matthew had never held a child like this before, not even as an uncle, not even as a neighbor helping out. But Ben leaned his head against his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was such a simple gesture, yet it stirred something deep in Matthew's chest. He wanted to freeze this moment and lock it away, a quiet, unspoken promise blooming between them. Emily eventually woke too, and she looked surprised to find Matthew still there. She didn't say anything about it, just offered a quiet, "Good morning," and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. Matthew followed her, watching how tired she still looked, how her shoulders moved a little more slowly than they used to. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Better than yesterday. The medicine helped. I can get more." "Anything you need," he said immediately. "You don't need to worry about costs." Emily gave a small nod, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and passed one to him. "Ben doesn't have school today," she said, changing the subject. "It's the weekend. We usually go to the park if I'm feeling well enough." Matthew hesitated, then said, "I'd like to come with you both. If that's okay." Emily paused, mug halfway to her lips, and looked at him properly for the first time since the night before. "I don't know what this is yet," she said softly. "You showing up. It feels like something from another life." "I know," he said. "But I'm not here to make grand gestures. I'm here because I should have been from the beginning." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she nodded. "Okay. You can come." Later that day, the 3 of them walked through the nearby park. It was small and quiet, with a few benches, a worn path, and a swing set that creaked in the breeze. Ben ran ahead, kicking leaves and laughing, the hood of his jacket bouncing behind him. Matthew stayed close to Emily, adjusting his pace to match hers. She still tired easily, and he noticed how she occasionally gripped her side or paused to catch her breath. They sat on a bench and watched Ben climb up the slide and go down over and over again, his joy unfiltered and contagious. "Is he always like this?" Matthew asked with a small smile. Emily smiled too, a little sadly. "He has more energy than I know what to do with. He's a good kid. Kind, thoughtful. He's always been that way. Even when I had nothing, he never complained." "You had him," Matthew said quietly. She turned to look at him again. "You know, he looks so much like you. I kept wondering if that would fade as he grew up. But it didn't." Matthew nodded, swallowing hard. "I see it now. And I hate that I missed all those years." "Then don't miss what's left," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. They sat in silence after that. Not a cold silence, but a quiet one, the kind that comes when people are finally beginning to understand each other again. When they got home that afternoon, Ben drew a picture of the 3 of them at the park. He handed it to Matthew with shy pride. "This is us," he said. "I can draw you again tomorrow if you stay." Matthew looked down at the drawing, crayon figures holding hands beneath a crooked tree, and felt his throat tighten. "I'll be here," he said, ruffling Ben's hair. "Tomorrow, and the day after that too." And for the first time in years, he meant every single word. The days that followed were quiet but full of subtle change. Matthew continued showing up each morning, sometimes bringing groceries, other times with small things for Ben like puzzles or snacks, careful never to overdo it. He didn't want to buy forgiveness or force affection, he just wanted to be there. Emily observed it all, always cautious but no longer cold. She had every reason to keep her walls up, but she never once pushed him away. Instead, she allowed him space to show who he was now, not who he had been when he walked away 7 years ago. One evening, as the sky darkened outside their small living room window and the sound of rain began to tap against the glass, Matthew offered to help prepare dinner. Emily looked skeptical at first. He had always been the type who ordered takeout or hired private chefs, but to her surprise, he moved around the kitchen like someone who had made the effort to learn. He chopped vegetables, boiled water, even asked Ben if he wanted to help stir the soup. It was ordinary. Domestic. But it felt like something sacred. Later, as they all sat at the table eating simple vegetable soup and buttered toast, Emily caught herself watching Matthew more than once. He laughed at Ben's silly stories, listened with real interest, and didn't check his phone once. There was no rush in him. No urgency. Just presence. That was new. After dinner, while Ben was brushing his teeth, Emily stood at the sink, washing dishes as Matthew dried them beside her. For a moment, they were quiet, only the soft clink of plates and the hum of the faucet filling the space. Then Emily spoke, not looking at him. "I never told him about you. I thought about it 1,000 times. But I couldn't bear to let him hope for something that might never happen." "I understand," Matthew said. "I wouldn't have believed me back then either." She nodded slowly. "I was angry for a long time. You left so cleanly. So completely. I thought if I hated you enough, it would hurt less." "And now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not angry anymore," she said, pausing to rinse a dish. "But I'm not sure I trust you either." "Not yet." He didn't flinch. "That's fair. I'm not here to be trusted on words. Just, let me show it. Every day, for as long as it takes." Later that night, Ben pulled out a puzzle and asked them both to help finish it. It was missing a few pieces, but they worked on it anyway, laughing when one didn't fit and celebrating each tiny success. It wasn't much. But it was theirs. At bedtime, Ben hugged Matthew without being asked, his small arms wrapping around his waist. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but no longer guarded. That night, Matthew didn't sleep at the house. He left after Ben was tucked in, stepping into the cool evening air. But as he walked away, he didn't feel shut out. He felt, for the first time, like someone who had been invited back to something he thought he had lost forever, not just a home, but a family. And somewhere deep inside, he began to believe that maybe he could be the man they needed, not through perfection, but through staying. Through showing up every single day. Over the following weeks, Matthew found himself adjusting to a rhythm that was completely foreign and yet strangely grounding. Mornings were no longer about boardrooms or private jets. Instead, they were about packing lunch for Ben, making sure Emily had what she needed for the day, and quietly sweeping the kitchen floor before anyone noticed. He didn't try to take over their lives. He simply fit into them, one small act at a time. He started learning what Ben liked, his favorite cereal, the way he liked his bedtime stories read with different voices for every character, the way he got quiet and thoughtful when he was worried about his mom but didn't know how to say it. Matthew didn't push him to talk, but he stayed nearby, letting the silence be safe. Emily remained cautious, but her walls were no longer made of steel. She let him in, piece by piece. Sometimes she'd ask him to pick Ben up from school, other times she'd let him handle the groceries, or even leave him alone in the house while she rested. Trust, he realized, wasn't some dramatic declaration. It was in the small permissions, the everyday allowances that made him feel like he was part of something real. One afternoon, Matthew picked Ben up from school and brought him to a bookstore nearby. It wasn't something extravagant or planned. It just happened. They wandered the aisles, and Ben's eyes lit up as he moved between shelves of adventure books and picture stories. When Matthew offered to buy him two, Ben hesitated. "Can I ask Mom first?" he said, clutching one book tightly. Matthew knelt down and said gently, "You can. But I promised she'd say yes." Ben nodded slowly, then whispered, "Okay." It wasn't just about permission, it was about loyalty. The boy's entire world had been his mother, and Matthew knew he had to respect that. When they got home and Emily saw the books, she smiled. "You picked good ones," she said, ruffling Ben's hair. Then, turning to Matthew, she added, "Thank you, for asking nothing and giving him something." That night, after Ben was asleep, Emily and Matthew sat in the living room with the TV on low. They weren't really watching. Emily was curled up in the corner of the couch with a blanket, sipping tea. She looked better, her skin had more color, and her energy was returning. Still, she was quiet, thoughtful. "He asked me last week if you were going to leave again," she said suddenly. Matthew sat up straighter. "What did you say?" "I told him I didn't know. Because I didn't want to lie to him. But I want to believe you won't." "I won't," he said. "I've walked away from too many things. I'm not walking away from this." She nodded slowly, then looked at him in a way she hadn't in years. Not as someone who had broken her, but as someone she was cautiously learning to see again. "He looks at you like you hung the stars," she said. "That's a powerful kind of hope to carry. Don't drop it." Matthew didn't promise anything more. He just stayed. Helped clean up the dishes. Made sure the front door was locked. Then left quietly, as he always did, giving them space to sleep. On his way home that night, he stopped by the side of the road, pulled over, and sat in silence. He wasn't crying, but something in him was breaking and rebuilding all at once. For years he had built walls of power and money to protect himself from failure, from love, from responsibility. But here he was, stripped of all that, and finally beginning to understand that real strength came not from control, but from showing up and being present even when it terrified him. He looked up at the stars that Ben believed he hung and whispered to himself, "This time, I'll be enough." And for the first time, he believed it might be true. By the time spring began to settle in, bringing with it longer days and the faint scent of blooming flowers on the breeze, Matthew had become a quiet fixture in Emily and Ben's life. It was no longer surprising to find him knocking gently on the door in the mornings or helping Ben tie his shoelaces before school. The neighborhood kids started calling him Ben's dad, without anyone correcting them, and even the clerk at the local grocery store had begun to greet him with casual familiarity. These small signs told Matthew more than any formal conversation could: he was becoming part of their world. Emily still moved carefully around him, not cold anymore, but measured. He understood that. He had no right to rush her forgiveness. Trust wasn't something he could demand, it had to be built, layered one consistent action at a time. He made sure she had everything she needed for her recovery: medication, fresh groceries, and time to rest. But more than that, he gave her space to breathe without feeling watched or owed. He didn't hover. He supported. One Sunday afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the windows and filled the small kitchen with warmth, Matthew cooked breakfast while Emily sat at the table sipping coffee. Ben was on the floor nearby with crayons and paper, humming softly to himself. It felt like a scene from another life, one Matthew never thought he'd get to live. He was flipping pancakes when Emily's voice broke the quiet. "You've changed," she said, not looking up from her mug. Matthew glanced over his shoulder. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a real thing," she replied. "And it's not just about the groceries or helping with Ben. It's the way you look at us now. Like you're actually here." "I am here," he said, setting a plate of pancakes in front of her. "I wish I had been sooner. But I'm here now." I'm not going anywhere. She gave him a look that was somewhere between skepticism and softness. That's still a hard sentence to believe coming from you. I know, he said quietly. That's why I don't say it more often. I just want to live it. Later that day, they went to the nearby community center for a spring event Ben had been excited about all week. There were games, music, balloons, and a bake sale. It wasn't anything grand, but it felt like a celebration of something ordinary, and Matthew loved every second of it. He held Ben's hand as they walked between booths, cheered as he won a small stuffed animal at the ring toss, and laughed when a cupcake exploded frosting all over his suit. Emily watched from a bench under the trees, her arms folded loosely across her chest, eyes following them. When they returned to her side, she looked up at Matthew and said something unexpected. He's never laughed this much in one day. Matthew didn't respond immediately. He sat down beside her and looked across the park, then turned to her with the most vulnerable honesty he had ever allowed himself. Neither have I. That night, after Ben had fallen asleep with his new toy clutched in his arms, Emily stood by the doorway as Matthew prepared to leave. She didn't speak right away. She just leaned against the frame, watching him gather his jacket and keys. You don't have to keep going home every night, she said suddenly. If you ever want to stay, not for good, but, for now. He looked at her, startled but grateful. I'd like that. She nodded. Ben would too. As he settled on the couch with a blanket, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing in the other room, Matthew realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about making up for the past anymore. It was about building a future. And for the first time, that future didn't scare him. It humbled him. He no longer needed skyscrapers or contracts to prove his worth. All he needed was right here, in a quiet house with creaky floors, a little boy who smiled in his sleep, and a woman who might, just maybe, be ready to believe in him again. By the time April gave way to early May, the air had shifted in more ways than one. The house felt different now, not just because of the blooming flowers on the windowsill or the new curtains Matthew had insisted on buying to replace the old sun-faded ones, but because of the unspoken comfort that had begun to settle between the three of them. The awkward pauses were gone. The guarded silences that once hovered in the space between Matthew and Emily had turned into something quieter, gentler, almost warm. They didn't talk about the past often anymore, and they didn't need to. Their conversations were about Ben's drawings, the groceries, the bills, the music playing on the radio. But under the surface of every word was the steady beat of rebuilding. Matthew had started staying over a few nights a week, always on the couch, never asking for more than what Emily was willing to give. But one morning, after a restless night of thunderstorms, he woke to find Ben curled up beside him, still half asleep, a hand clinging to Matthew's shirt. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply lay still, staring at the ceiling in the dim morning light, overwhelmed by how much that one small gesture meant. It wasn't just about love. It was trust. And it wasn't something he could ever take lightly. Emily had gotten stronger, though her illness still cast a shadow. The treatments were working, but slowly. Some days were good, full of energy and brightness, and others left her so exhausted she barely spoke. But she let Matthew carry more on the hard days. She stopped pretending she didn't need help. That, in itself, was a kind of intimacy he hadn't expected. He learned how to read the signs, the way she rubbed her temple when she was dizzy, the way her voice got quieter when she was tired. He never made a show of it. He simply acted. He took care of her, the way he should have long ago, not out of guilt, but because he had grown into the kind of man who didn't run from pain. Especially not hers. One evening, just after dinner, Ben pulled a folded piece of paper from his backpack and handed it to Matthew. "We have family day at school next week," he said, almost shyly. "You're allowed to come, if you want." Matthew took the paper and felt his throat tighten. Emily, sitting across the table, paused mid-sip of her tea and looked over the rim of her mug. Her eyes met his, soft but steady. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She was letting him decide. "I'd love to come," he told Ben, who beamed and immediately launched into a list of activities they'd be doing, games, presentations, even a small performance he'd been practicing in secret. That moment stayed with Matthew for days. He remembered it while driving to meetings. He remembered it while sitting in his penthouse, suddenly too quiet, too big, too cold. He didn't want to split his life anymore. The idea of going back to who he had been, someone detached, controlled, powerful on paper but empty behind closed doors, sickened him. He went to family day. Wore a casual sweater and jeans, sat cross-legged on the classroom floor, clapped the loudest during Ben's skit. Other parents whispered when they recognized him, their kids pointing, some teachers double-taking, but he didn't care. He wasn't there as Matthew Carter, CEO. He was just Ben's dad. On the way home, Ben fell asleep in the back seat. Emily sat in the passenger seat, watching the rain streak the windshield. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely audible over the wipers. "I thought I'd raise him alone forever. I made peace with it." Matthew gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "I'm sorry I made that feel like your only option." She turned to look at him. "You didn't just disappear, Matthew. You erased yourself. And somehow, you still showed up exactly when he needed you." "I wish it hadn't taken that long," he said, glancing at her before turning back to the road. "But I'm here now. And I'll be here every day that follows." Emily looked out the window again. "I believe you," she said quietly. He felt the words land deep in his chest. Not because they were dramatic, but because they weren't. They were simple. Earned. Honest. That night, after Ben had been tucked into bed, Emily brought out an old box from the closet. Inside were photos, ones Matthew had never seen, of Ben as a baby, of Emily holding him in a hospital room alone, of birthdays, scraped knees, and laughter he hadn't been there to hear. She didn't say much while he looked through them. She just sat beside him on the floor, close but not touching, allowing him that space. When he finished, he turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like, if I'd stayed?" She nodded. "All the time. But I also think about what we're doing now. And I think, maybe, this matters more." He didn't answer. He simply reached out, slowly, and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, with old photographs scattered across the floor and the echo of a child's laughter down the hallway, Matthew realized something he hadn't dared to believe before: forgiveness was possible. And maybe, just maybe, so was love. Summer arrived with gentle heat and long evenings, and by the time June rolled in, the rhythm of their days had become something close to natural. There were still rough moments. Emily had occasional flare-ups, moments when exhaustion took over, but the worst seemed to be behind her. Matthew remained consistent, never missing a day, never needing to be asked. The quiet tension that once followed every interaction between him and Emily had softened into something far more intimate, though still unspoken. It lived in the way she handed him coffee in the morning without asking how he took it anymore, in the way he knew where every dish went in the kitchen, and in how Ben no longer hesitated before calling him Dad. The boy said it casually now, like it had always been true, and Matthew never corrected it. He didn't care that the word had taken time to reach his ears. What mattered was that it had come on its own, without pressure. It was the same way Emily had begun to lean on him, not out of desperation, but from trust built slowly, brick by brick. She let him read Ben bedtime stories even when she wasn't too tired to do it herself. She let him cook, even when he added too much garlic. She let him stay over more often than not, and one night, without ceremony or hesitation, she invited him to sleep beside her, not out of romance, but comfort. He didn't push for more. He simply held her hand and listened to her breathing as she drifted off. Then came the moment he didn't know he had been waiting for. It was a warm Sunday morning, and they were all in the backyard. Emily was seated in a lawn chair under the shade of an old maple tree, watching as Matthew and Ben built a birdhouse together at the small garden table. Ben wore a serious expression, completely focused as he hammered a small nail into the side of the wooden frame, while Matthew held the pieces steady, nodding with approval. The sun made everything feel golden, easy and still. When the birdhouse was done and Ben went inside to grab paintbrushes, Emily stood up and walked over to Matthew. She looked at him for a long time before speaking, and when she did, her voice was calm and certain. "You never asked for forgiveness," she said. He looked up at her. "I didn't think I had the right." "You didn't," she said gently, "but you earned it anyway." He didn't know what to say. For once, there were no rehearsed speeches, no need to explain himself. She had already seen every version of him, the boy who left, the man who returned, the father who stayed. She reached for his hand, and he took it. There was no need to squeeze too hard or hold too long. It was just enough. Later that evening, while Ben was asleep, they sat in the living room surrounded by the quiet hum of cicadas and the soft flicker of candlelight. Emily rested her head on Matthew's shoulder, and for the first time, she said the words he had longed for but never demanded. "I still love you," she whispered. Matthew's eyes burned, but he didn't move. He just let the words settle, like soil around deep roots. He kissed the top of her head and replied without hesitation. "I never stopped." From that moment on, they stopped living in the shadow of what had been and finally stepped into what could be. Matthew sold his penthouse and moved into a smaller home nearby, a house they picked together, where Ben could have his own room and a backyard big enough for a treehouse. He reduced his work hours, turning over much of the daily management to a trusted partner, and focused on what mattered. Not deals or quarterly goals, but morning walks to school, grocery store runs with sticky notes written in Ben's handwriting, and evenings spent making dinner while music played in the background. There were still hard days, of course. Emily's health required monitoring, and Matthew sometimes wrestled with the weight of all the time he had lost. But every night, when they sat on the couch with Ben nestled between them and laughter rising from some silly joke or a shared memory, he felt peace, real, earned peace. The story didn't end in a perfect bow. It didn't need to. It ended in the way real stories do, with the quiet, everyday miracle of people who chose one another again and again. Through hurt. Through healing. Through time. It ended not with a grand finale, but with something better, a life, finally whole. To me, the ending of this story isn't about redemption in the dramatic sense, it's about quiet, persistent healing. It's not about a grand apology fixing everything overnight, but about a man showing up every single day to earn back what he once walked away from. The most powerful part is that forgiveness doesn't come wrapped in a speech, it grows slowly, through shared meals, bedtime stories, and small, ordinary acts of love. That's what makes it believable and moving. Emily's strength is in her quiet resilience, raising a child alone without bitterness, and allowing someone who hurt her back into her life, not out of weakness, but because she sees that he's no longer the man who left. And Matthew's transformation is honest, he doesn't try to erase the past, he just chooses to be better in the present. That's the real happy ending, not perfection, but the courage to begin again, together. Garrett Hale was used to power, control, and predictability. Nothing in his world ever caught him off guard. Until two identical 6-year-old girls appeared in front of him, their wide blue eyes locking onto his. "Sir, we're lost," one of them said. The other nodded. "And we were looking for you." Garrett froze, his mind racing. Looking for him? Before he could process what was happening, he found himself exhaling sharply. "All right," he muttered. "Let's figure this out." Garrett Hale moved quickly down the sidewalk, his eyes focused ahead as he checked his watch. He was late for a meeting, something that almost never happened. His life was built on discipline and control, and lateness was a weakness he didn't tolerate, especially in himself. His driver was already waiting by the curb, the sleek black car gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Just as he reached for the door handle, a small voice stopped him. "Sir." Garrett turned sharply, frowning. Standing just a few feet away were two little girls, no older than 6. They had identical dark curls framing their small faces, and their striking blue eyes, unmistakably the same shade as his own, stared up at him with a mix of uncertainty and determination. His first instinct was to glance around, searching for a frantic parent or guardian, but the sidewalk was mostly empty. The girls were alone. "Are you lost?" he asked, keeping his voice even. One of them hesitated, biting her lip before shaking her head. The other, who looked slightly more confident, took a step forward. "We were looking for you." Garrett stiffened, his grip on the car door tightening. That was not an answer he had expected. "You were looking for me," he repeated, his voice measured. Both girls nodded at the same time. Garrett felt a strange unease settle in his chest. Children didn't just go searching for corporate CEOs. Something about this wasn't right. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The Boulder twin hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "At home." Garrett narrowed his eyes. "Do they know you're here?" This time, the answer didn't come as quickly. The quieter twin shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her small backpack. The slight guilt on her face told him everything he needed to know. "No," she admitted softly. Garrett exhaled slowly, glancing between the two of them. They didn't seem scared, which only added to the strangeness of the situation. If they weren't lost, and if their parents didn't know they were here, then why had they come? "And why exactly were you looking for me?" he asked, crossing his arms. The girls exchanged a glance. The one who had spoken more pulled something out of her backpack and held it out to him. It was an old photograph. Garrett took it, his breath catching in his throat as his gaze fell on the image. It was him. Younger, dressed in a casual button-down shirt, standing beside a woman with soft brown eyes and dark curls. He knew this picture. He knew her. Mallory Carter. A name he hadn't thought about in years. His eyes flicked back to the twins, something cold running down his spine. "She's our mom," the girl said quietly. Garrett's pulse pounded in his ears. He looked down at the photograph again, then back at the two little girls with identical blue eyes. For the first time in years, Garrett Hale had no idea what to say. Garrett stared at the photograph in his hand, his fingers tightening around the worn edges. The image was slightly faded, but there was no mistaking the two people in it, him and Mallory. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even thought about her in a long time. Yet here he was, standing on a busy sidewalk, confronted by two little girls who claimed she was their mother. His mind raced through the possibilities, searching for an explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong person. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. But as he looked at them again, those wide blue eyes staring up at him with quiet anticipation, he knew deep down that it wasn't a mistake at all. "Where is your mother now?" he asked, his voice controlled, but not as steady as usual. "At home," the Boulder twin said. "She doesn't know we're here." Garrett felt something shift inside him. "You ran away." The quieter girl hesitated before nodding. "We wanted to find you." His grip on the photo tightened as he processed their words. Mallory hadn't sent them. They had come on their own, which meant she either hadn't told them about him or hadn't expected them to ever meet him. Either way, they had found him, and now he had two 6-year-old girls standing in front of him, expecting something from him that he wasn't sure he could give. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, running a hand through his dark curls. He wasn't used to dealing with children, let alone two who had tracked him down like this. "Your mother must be worried sick." The first twin, Lily, as he later learned, shifted slightly. "We thought she wouldn't notice." Garrett let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had built his life on structure, control, and calculated decisions. Nothing in his world was ever left to chance. But this? Two little girls showing up out of nowhere with eyes that mirrored his own. This wasn't something he could have planned for. "How did you even find me?" he finally asked. Sophie, the quieter twin, pulled something else from her backpack, a piece of paper folded several times. She handed it to him, and as he unfolded it, he immediately recognized what it was. A printed copy of his company's address. Garrett frowned. "Where did you get this?" "In a box in Mom's closet," Lily admitted. "She had some letters and papers. We saw your name and looked it up." Garrett inhaled deeply, trying to contain the growing frustration inside him. They had gone through Mallory's things, found his name, and somehow managed to make their way here without her knowing. That alone was reckless. But what weighed on him more heavily was the fact that Mallory had clearly kept traces of him in her life, even if she had never reached out. "You should have told her where you were going," he said finally. "We didn't think you'd be mad," Sophie said, looking at him with a slight frown. "We just wanted to know who you were." Her words cut deeper than he expected. Garrett had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding anything that tied him down. He had never considered what might have happened after he and Mallory went their separate ways. He had never once thought that there could be two little girls growing up without knowing who he was. And now they were here. "You know now," he said, his voice quieter. "What happens next?" The girls looked at each other, then back at him. "Can we talk to Mom first?" Lily asked. Garrett exhaled. That was the only thing that made sense. He couldn't stand here on a sidewalk with two lost children and pretend he knew what to do next. "Get in the car," he said, nodding toward his sleek black vehicle. "I'm taking you home." As they climbed in, Garrett sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had come here today expecting a routine business meeting. Instead, he was driving two little girls, his daughters, to a woman he hadn't seen in almost 7 years. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. The drive to the girls' home was quiet, but not the kind of comfortable silence Garrett was used to. This silence felt heavy, loaded with questions he wasn't ready to ask and answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Lily and Sophie sat in the back seat, their small bodies barely filling the luxurious leather seats of his car. They weren't scared, which surprised him. If anything, they seemed expectant. As if they had known all along that he would take them home. Garrett's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he turned onto a familiar street. He hadn't been here in years, but everything looked the same. The row of townhouses, the tree-lined sidewalk, the small neighborhood park at the end of the block, it all felt like a place frozen in time. He pulled up to a modest but well-kept house and parked in the driveway. The moment he shut off the engine, the front door burst open. Mallory stood on the porch, her dark brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face pale with worry. The instant she spotted the twins in the back seat, her expression shifted from fear to relief, then to something much sharper, anger. Before Garrett could even step out of the car, she was already moving toward them, her footsteps quick and full of purpose. "Lily. Sophie." Her voice was breathless, desperate. "What were you thinking?" Both girls scrambled out of the car as soon as Garrett unlocked the doors. They ran to their mother, their heads ducked in guilt as she pulled them into a tight hug. "We're sorry, Mom," Sophie mumbled against her shoulder. "We just wanted to see him," Lily added softly. Mallory squeezed them tighter before pulling back, her hands gripping their arms gently but firmly. "You scared me half to death," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't just run off like that." Garrett stood beside his car, watching the scene unfold. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, but he hadn't been ready for the raw emotion in Mallory's eyes when she looked at her daughters. Finally, she straightened, her gaze snapping to him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Garrett met her eyes, keeping his voice even. They came to find me. I brought them home. Mallory exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. Of course they did. She turned back to the girls. Go inside. Now. Lily and Sophie hesitated, casting a glance at Garrett before nodding. They walked toward the house, their heads down, leaving the two adults standing in tense silence. Once the front door closed behind them, Mallory crossed her arms. So, she said, her voice low and controlled. Now you know. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah. Now I know. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Took you long enough. His jaw clenched. You never told me, Mallory. Her expression hardened. Would it have made a difference? Garrett didn't have an answer to that. And the fact that he didn't frustrated him more than anything. Mallory sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Look, I don't want to do this out here. Come inside. He hesitated for a second before following her up the steps. The inside of the house was warm, lived in. It wasn't big, but it was full of life. Children's drawings pinned to the fridge, a basket of laundry sitting by the couch, a few toys scattered near the stairs. It smelled like cinnamon and something vaguely floral, a scent that was familiar in a way that made something in his chest tighten. Mallory gestured toward the kitchen. Sit. Garrett pulled out a chair at the small wooden table, watching as she poured herself a cup of coffee before turning to him. You want one? She asked. No. She shrugged, taking a sip before sitting across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Mallory set her cup down and looked him in the eye. I never planned on you finding out. Garrett exhaled slowly. Why? She let out a humorless chuckle. You're really asking me that? Yes, Mallory, I am, he said, his voice steady but firm. You had to know I would have wanted to know. She stared at him for a long time before answering. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought about telling you, she admitted. I really did. But you were already gone, Garrett. You were moving up in the world, making your name. And I knew what would happen if I told you. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You would have felt obligated, she said simply. Not because you wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. And I didn't want that. I didn't want you in their life out of duty. I wanted you in their life because you wanted to be there. Garrett clenched his jaw. That wasn't your decision to make. Maybe not, Mallory admitted. But I made it anyway. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. Garrett glanced toward the living room, where he could hear the faint sound of the girls talking upstairs. His daughters. I want to be in their lives, he said finally. Mallory studied him carefully. Why now? Because I should have been there from the beginning, he said. And because they came looking for me. That has to mean something. She looked down at her coffee cup, tracing the rim with her finger. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. They've always wondered about you, she admitted. I never lied to them. I just, never gave them answers. And I think that only made them more curious. Garrett nodded slowly. Mallory took a deep breath. All right, she said. If you really want to be in their lives, then prove it. His gaze sharpened. How? She gave him a small, tired smile. Show up. It was the simplest challenge, but somehow, it felt like the hardest one. Garrett had spent years showing up for meetings, for business deals, for contracts worth millions. But this? This was different. This time, he wasn't just proving himself to a boardroom. He was proving himself to them. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, but Garrett's mind was anything but. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched as he replayed everything Mallory had said. She had kept them from him. His daughters. The anger he had felt in her kitchen still lingered, simmering just below the surface. But beneath it, there was something else. Something deeper. Guilt. Because no matter how much he wanted to be furious with Mallory, he couldn't ignore the truth. She had been right about one thing. Back then, he wouldn't have known what to do. He had been too focused on his career, too obsessed with proving himself in the corporate world. If she had told him, would he have made the right choice? He didn't know. And that uncertainty was worse than the anger. When he finally pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, he let out a slow breath, trying to clear his thoughts. He stepped out of the car and headed straight for the elevator, barely acknowledging the doorman who greeted him. His penthouse was just as he had left it, pristine, silent, untouched. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in the distance, the twinkling lights of skyscrapers stretching endlessly beyond the glass. It was the kind of view people dreamed of. But right now, it just felt empty. He walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey, taking a slow sip as he stared out at the city. His mind drifted back to earlier that evening. The way Lily and Sophie had looked at him when they asked who he was. The way they had clung to Mallory when they realized she was upset. They weren't just two random children. They were his. His daughters. The thought sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation through him. It was different from business, from deals, from anything he had ever handled before. It wasn't something he could strategize his way through. He had spent years making decisions that shaped entire industries, but he had never made a decision as important as this. Could he do this? Would they even want him to? The sharp buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen. Mallory. He hesitated for only a second before answering. Yeah. There was a pause on the other end before she spoke. The girls won't stop talking about you. Garrett exhaled, running a hand through his curls. Is that a good thing? Mallory let out a soft laugh, but there was something tired beneath it. I don't know yet. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she sighed. Look. I know today was a lot. For all of us. But if you're serious about being in their lives, I need to know that you're really going to be there. Not just today. Not just when it's convenient. Garrett leaned against the counter, staring at the dark liquid in his glass. I meant what I said, he replied. I want to be there. There was another pause, then a quieter voice. Then prove it. Garrett frowned slightly. How? Come back tomorrow, Mallory said simply. Spend time with them. Get to know them. He inhaled slowly, then nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Okay. Okay, she echoed. Then I'll see you tomorrow. She ended the call before he could say anything else. Garrett set his phone down and took another slow sip of whiskey. For the first time in his life, he was stepping into something he couldn't control. Something uncertain. Something messy. But for some reason, it didn't scare him as much as it should have. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals or profits or power. He was thinking about them. Garrett arrived at Mallory's house the next afternoon, earlier than he had planned. He sat in his car for a few moments, staring at the front door, trying to ignore the unusual weight pressing down on his chest. He had walked into boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, negotiated billion-dollar deals with men who would sell their own families for profit, and yet, nothing had ever made him feel as unprepared as this. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way to the porch. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Lily stood there, blinking up at him, surprise flickering across her face. You're here. Garrett arched an eyebrow. You sound like you weren't expecting me. She shrugged. Mom said you would come, but Sophie said you might change your mind. Something about that struck a nerve. And what did you think? Lily tilted her head, considering. I thought if you really wanted to be here, you'd come early. Garrett smirked slightly. Then I guess I passed the test. Before she could say anything else, Sophie appeared behind her. She stared at him for a moment, then turned her head slightly. Mom, he's actually here. Mallory's voice drifted in from the kitchen. Let him in before you keep making announcements, Sophie. The twins stepped aside, and Garrett walked in, feeling the warmth of the house settle around him. The smell of something sweet lingered in the air, like cinnamon and vanilla. The living room was tidy but lived in, filled with small details that made it feel like a home: picture frames on the shelves, a blanket draped over the couch, a few scattered toys near the staircase. It was nothing like the cold, minimalist penthouse he returned to every night. Mallory emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She glanced at the clock before giving him an approving look. You're early. Garrett shrugged. Lily said that was the only way to prove I wanted to be here. Mallory smiled faintly, shaking her head. They're tougher than they look. Lily grinned. We get it from Mom. Mallory rolled her eyes. All right, enough ganging up on him. You two go get your coats. We're going out. Garrett raised an eyebrow. We are. Mallory nodded. I figured if you're serious about getting to know them, sitting awkwardly in my living room isn't the best way to do it. He couldn't argue with that. A few minutes later, they were in his car, heading toward the park. The girls chattered in the back seat, sometimes to him, sometimes to each other, filling the silence in a way that was surprisingly comfortable. So, you're rich, right? Sophie asked suddenly. Garrett glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Something like that. Lily leaned forward slightly. How rich? Mallory sighed. Girls. What? Lily said innocently. It's a fair question. Garrett smirked. Rich enough. Sophie squinted at him. Like, rich enough to have a pet tiger. Garrett chuckled. Why would I need a tiger? Lily shrugged. Because you're a CEO. CEOs do weird things sometimes. Mallory groaned. Please don't assume every CEO is a lunatic. Sophie crossed her arms. Then what's the point of being rich if you don't have something cool? Garrett thought for a moment. I have a plane. The twins exchanged wide-eyed glances. You have a plane? Lily asked. Garrett nodded. And a helicopter. Sophie's mouth dropped open. Can we ride in it? Mallory turned in her seat. Absolutely not. Garrett smirked. Maybe someday. The twins whispered excitedly to each other as Mallory shot him a warning glare. He just shrugged, amused by how quickly they had latched onto the idea. At the park, the girls ran ahead, their laughter filling the crisp autumn air. Garrett stood beside Mallory, watching them climb onto the swings. They like you, she said after a moment. Garrett glanced at her. Yeah. Mallory nodded. But they don't trust easily. If you're going to be in their lives, don't make promises you can't keep. Garrett's jaw tightened. I don't break promises. Mallory studied him, as if trying to decide if she could believe that. After a long pause, she nodded. Good. They stood in silence, watching as Sophie leaped off the swing with a triumphant laugh, followed quickly by Lily. For the first time in years, Garrett felt something shift inside him. And for once, he wasn't afraid of it. The days that followed were unlike anything Garrett had experienced before. His usual routine, structured, disciplined, and predictable, had been disrupted by two small forces of nature named Lily and Sophie. Instead of back-to-back meetings and business negotiations, he now found himself answering rapid-fire questions about everything from his favorite food to whether or not he had ever fought a shark. He had expected them to be distant, hesitant around him, but that wasn't how they worked. They were careful at first, studying him the way one might examine something unfamiliar, but once they decided he wasn't going anywhere, they wasted no time in making him part of their world. It was overwhelming. And strangely, he didn't mind. On the fourth day, Mallory called him. He had just finished reviewing a contract when he picked up, leaning back in his office chair. "They won't stop asking when you're coming back," she said before he could even greet her. Garrett smirked, glancing at the clock. "Miss me already?" Mallory snorted. "Not me. Them." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived at the house, the front door opened before he could even knock. Lily and Sophie barreled out, their faces lighting up as they grabbed his hands. "Mom said we could go get ice cream," Sophie announced. "Can we?" Lily asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "You do realize it's almost dinner time, right?" Lily nodded solemnly. "That's why we have to go before Mom changes her mind." Mallory appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "I never agreed to before dinner." Lily and Sophie turned identical pleading gazes on their mother, eyes wide with dramatic innocence. Mallory sighed. "Fine. But small portions." The girls cheered as Garrett led them to the car. The drive was filled with endless chatter, with Lily and Sophie debating over what flavors were the best. "Chocolate is obviously the best," Lily declared. "That's so basic," Sophie argued. "Mint chocolate chip is better." Garrett smirked. "You know, I'm more of a vanilla guy myself." Both girls gasped in exaggerated horror. Mallory, from the passenger seat, shook her head. "And you want to be a part of their lives?" Garrett laughed, something that still felt strange coming so naturally. "Guess I'll have to work on my taste." At the ice cream shop, the girls wasted no time picking their flavors. As they ate, Sophie suddenly looked up at him, her expression more serious than usual. "Are you gonna be here for our birthday?" The question caught him off guard. "When's your birthday?" "Next month," Lily said, licking her spoon. Garrett glanced at Mallory, who was watching him carefully. He looked back at the twins. "Of course, I'll be here." Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay." Garrett wasn't sure why, but that single word felt like more than just an acknowledgement. It felt like a test. One he wasn't going to fail. A week passed, and Garrett found himself slipping into a new rhythm, one that felt completely foreign yet oddly natural at the same time. His life had always been structured, controlled, every moment accounted for. But now, his days were interrupted by excited phone calls from Lily and Sophie, invitations to come over, and the expectation that he would actually show up. And he did. At first, he had assumed the twins would treat him like a guest in their lives, someone new and unfamiliar, but they had no hesitation in pulling him directly into their world. They had opinions about everything, what kind of shoes he should wear, what movies he needed to watch, and even how he should style his hair. He had expected it to be exhausting. Instead, it was grounding. One evening, as he sat in Mallory's kitchen, watching Lily and Sophie attempt to teach him how to braid hair using one of their dolls, he realized something unsettling. He didn't want this to be temporary. He had spent his entire life believing that work was the most important thing, that love and family were distractions, that emotions only made a man weak. But sitting here, with two 6-year-olds laughing at his failed attempt to braid synthetic blonde strands, he couldn't remember why he had ever thought that. Mallory leaned against the counter, watching the scene with an amused expression. "They've got you wrapped around their little fingers." Garrett glanced up, smirking. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sophie lifted her head. "He's actually not that bad at braiding." Lily nodded. "Yeah, for a beginner." Mallory shook her head. "They're just being nice. That braid is a disaster." Garrett sighed, setting the doll down. Fine. I accept defeat. Sophie grinned. You'll get better with practice. The thought settled into his chest, warm and unfamiliar. After the girls had gone to bed, Garrett stayed behind. Mallory handed him a cup of tea, something she had always done when they were together, back when things were simpler. He held the cup between his hands, studying her carefully. You're letting me in, he said after a moment. Mallory exhaled, crossing her arms. I guess I am. Why? She hesitated before answering. Because I see the way they look at you. They like having you around. She glanced toward the hallway where the twins' bedroom was. And I think they need you. Garrett swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. And what about you? Mallory let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I don't know yet. He nodded, setting his cup down. That's fair. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them no longer as tense as it had been weeks ago. Mallory finally sighed. You're really staying, aren't you? Garrett met her gaze. Yeah. I am. For the first time, she didn't challenge him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for an escape. Garrett had never imagined that a single moment could shift the course of his life so completely. He had spent years believing that control and precision were the keys to success, that emotions were liabilities, and that family was a distraction. But now, as he stood in Mallory's kitchen again, helping Lily and Sophie decorate cupcakes for their upcoming birthday, he realized how wrong he had been. The kitchen was filled with laughter and the scent of vanilla. The twins were covered in flour and frosting, their small hands making a mess of the counter as they carefully placed colorful sprinkles on top of the cupcakes. Garrett had tried to help, but after smudging blue icing on Sophie's nose and earning himself a scolding from Lily for ruining the aesthetic, he had been demoted to cleanup duty. You're taking this very seriously, Garrett said, watching Lily examine a cupcake as if she were judging a 5-star meal. It has to be perfect, she said, adjusting the sprinkles with a careful hand. It's our birthday. Sophie licked frosting off her fingers. I think they look fine. Fine isn't good enough, Lily muttered. Garrett smirked. Sounds like someone I know. Mallory, who had been watching from across the kitchen, raised an eyebrow. Wonder where she gets that from. Lily and Sophie finished their cupcakes and hopped down from their stools, satisfied with their work. Can we show them to Mom? Lily asked. Garrett nodded. Go ahead. The girls ran off, their laughter trailing behind them. As soon as they were out of sight, Mallory turned to Garrett, crossing her arms. So, birthday presents. Garrett leaned against the counter. What about them? Mallory gave him a look. You're planning on spoiling them, aren't you? Garrett smirked. I don't know what you're talking about. Garrett. He sighed, lifting his hands in surrender. Fine. I may have gone a little overboard. Mallory rolled her eyes. How overboard? Let's just say, there may be a pony involved. She groaned. You bought them a pony? Garrett smirked. Technically, I haven't bought it yet. Mallory covered her face with her hands. I can't believe this. They deserve something special, he said, his voice softer now. Mallory dropped her hands and met his gaze. They don't need grand gestures, Garrett. They need you. He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. After a long pause, he nodded. I know. Mallory sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where the girls had disappeared. They really love having you here, you know. Garrett swallowed. I love being here. Mallory hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small smile. Then stay. Garrett didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. Because in his heart, he already knew. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. This story is more than just a tale about a billionaire discovering he has children. It's about responsibility, redemption, and the realization that true success isn't measured in wealth but in the relationships we build. Garrett starts as a man who believes he has control over everything: his career, his emotions, his future. But the arrival of Lily and Sophie challenges everything he thought he knew. At first, he struggles, unsure of how to fit into their world. Yet, as the story unfolds, he realizes that being a father isn't about grand gestures or financial security, it's about showing up. Lily and Sophie, despite their young age, are not just passive characters in his transformation. They are the ones who push him to grow, who demand honesty and presence. Their innocence and curiosity force Garrett to confront the choices he's made and the life he's been avoiding. Mallory, too, represents a crucial part of his journey. She isn't just the mother of his children, she is a reminder of who he used to be and a challenge to who he can become. Her reluctance to let him back into their lives isn't about resentment, it's about protecting the daughters she raised alone. The beauty of the ending isn't in perfection but in progress. Garrett doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Mallory immediately trust him. But what makes the ending powerful is that he chooses to stay. He chooses to show up, day after day, proving not just to Mallory and the girls, but to himself, that he wants to be part of this family. The final moment, where he realizes he's not just someone passing through their lives but someone who belongs there, is what makes the story truly meaningful. Because, in the end, Garrett Hale doesn't just gain daughters, he gains a reason to live beyond his empire.